I want to tell you something about Kelvar Station before the battle, before the smoke, before everything that happened in those 5 hours that nobody in the galaxy has been able to fully explain. I want to tell you what it felt like to be there. Because I was there. I was standing on Platform 7, Section Bravo, holding a datapad with casualty projections on it, and I remember looking at those numbers and feeling something I had never felt in 32 years of service with the Galactic Coalition. I felt done. Not tired, not defeated. Just done. Like the universe had made a decision without asking me, and I had no right to argue. The numbers were clear. The Varath Dominion fleet was 12 minutes out. We had 4 operational defense cannons, 2 of which were running on backup power cells that hadn't been calibrated in 8 months. We had approximately 340 soldiers across all species, Tharan, Veloci, Meridian, a few Seculans who volunteered when nobody asked them to. Good fighters, every one of them. Trained, disciplined, ready to die if it came to it. It was going to come to it. The Dominion was bringing 47 warships. 47. The lead vessel alone was the Keth Magorath, an obliterator-class destroyer that had taken apart 2 full Coalition outposts in the last 18 months. The Keth Magorath had armor plating that our defense cannons couldn't scratch. I knew that because we'd tried. At the Battle of Orin's Crossing, a Coalition frigate had fired 63 rounds at that hull and accomplished exactly nothing. 47 ships against Kelvar Station. 340 soldiers, 4 cannons, and a station that had been built 40 years ago as a transit hub for ore haulers. I need you to understand what Kelvar Station was. It wasn't a military installation. Not really. It had been converted into one when the war started, when someone in the high command looked at a star map and realized that Kelvar Station sat at the exact gravitational intersection of 3 major supply lanes. If the Dominion took Kelvar, they controlled the flow of food, medicine, fuel, and weapons to roughly 180 Coalition worlds. The math wasn't complicated. Kelvar fell. 180 worlds suffocated over the following 18 months. So we were there. The Coalition had scraped together what it could, sent it to Kelvar, and told us to hold. Nobody told us how. The station smelled like coolant and something burned. It always did. The environmental systems had been struggling since a Dominion probe strike had taken out the secondary ventilation array 6 weeks before. Every corridor had this background haze to it, thin but present, and under the light strips that ran along the ceiling it made everything look slightly blue, like the air itself was bruised. My name is Saren Vaz. Was, a Strategic Coordination Officer, First Class, with the Galactic Coalition's 7th Deployment Division. I say was because I retired after what happened at Kelvar, not because I was broken by it. The opposite, actually. I retired because after that day, after those 5 hours, I didn't feel like I had anything left to prove in a uniform. I had seen enough to last 3 lifetimes. I am telling this story because people have heard pieces of it. Fragments. The official Coalition reports. The Dominion's counter-narratives. The documentary that the Meridian Broadcasting Council put together 2 years after the battle, which got some things right and several things very wrong. Nobody has told the whole story from the station floor. So I'm telling it. It was 3:17 hours station time, when the first long-range sensors picked up the Dominion fleet, moving out of warp. I was in the coordination room, a wide, low-ceilinged space on level 4 that we turned into a command hub by shoving all the original freight management consoles to the walls and stacking military-grade comm arrays down the center. It had no windows. The light was the harsh white kind that makes everyone look slightly unwell. Commander Viral Tesh was standing at the main display when the alert came in. She was Tharan, tall, dark-scaled, 4-fingered hands that moved very precisely when she worked a console, like each finger knew exactly where it was supposed to go. She had been a soldier for 50 years, which in Tharan terms means she was still relatively young, but experienced enough to have earned the kind of quiet that came from having seen too much. She looked at the display. She didn't say anything for about 10 seconds. Then she said, "Get everyone up." That was all. I was the one who sent the wake alerts to all sections. I was the one who pulled up the casualty projections for the 14th time and confirmed what I already knew. I was the one who drafted the emergency distress signal that we'd already sent 3 times in the past 36 hours and received no response to. Actually, that's not quite accurate. We had received 1 response. About 22 hours before the Dominion fleet came out of warp, we'd gotten a single-line reply to our distress signal. It came from a coalition relay station about 40 light minutes away. The message said, "Reinforcements dispatched. ETA 26 hours, human unit. 14th Rapid Assault Division." And then nothing else. At the time, we didn't know what to do with that. 26 hours was too long. The Dominion was going to be here in under 24. And human unit, nobody in the coordination room had any strong feelings about that one way or the other. Humans were relatively new to the coalition, only been members for about 30 years, and while they'd participated in various engagements, nobody at Kelvar had ever worked alongside them directly. We knew what the data files said. Medium-sized species, bipedal, fragile by most galactic standards, creative thinkers, emotionally volatile. Apparently their training programs were interesting, whatever that meant. But it didn't matter, they'd arrive late. The battle would be over before they got here. That's what I thought at 3:17 when Commander Tesh sent everyone to stations. The humans were irrelevant. They'd arrived to a ruin. Between 3:17 and the time the Dominion fleet dropped into attack range, there was roughly 40 minutes of preparation. I've thought about those 40 minutes many times since. The station mobilized with the particular efficiency that comes from people who know they're probably going to die and have decided they might as well do it properly. There was no panic. That always surprises people when I tell them. They expect stories of chaos, of soldiers breaking down, of frightened faces and trembling hands. But the fear at Kelvar in those 40 minutes wasn't that kind. It was quiet, interior. Everyone had swallowed it whole and gotten to work. The Tharan soldiers moved to their positions along the upper corridors. They were exceptional in close-quarters combat, their natural armor plating giving them an advantage that most species envied, and they positioned themselves at every major junction point, with the calm of chess pieces being placed by someone who understood the game. The Veloci fighters took the ventilation network. They were small, about half the height of a Tharan, but they could navigate ductwork with something close to supernatural ease, and in a station environment, control of the duct system meant you had access to every room. Commander Tesh had them linked to a comm network with a frequency that was nearly impossible for Dominion jammers to disrupt. She'd thought of that 6 weeks ago, apparently. She'd been planning for this longer than I realized. The Meridians handled the external defense cannons. They had the best mathematical processing of any species on the station. They could calculate firing solutions in roughly 1/5 the time it took an equivalent targeting computer. They took their positions at the cannon controls and began running warm-up sequences on the two that actually had full power. I stayed in the coordination room. My job was to maintain a complete picture of what was happening across the entire station and feed that information to Commander Tesh and the section leaders. I had 12 screens and 4 comm channels, and a datapad with casualty projections that I turned face down on the console because I didn't need to see it again. At 3:41, Commander Tesh came into the coordination room and stood beside me for a moment, looking at the main display where the Dominion fleet was now visible, as a cluster of red contact markers moving at a steady, unhurried pace toward the station. She said, "Anything new from the human unit?" I said, "Nothing since the initial reply." She made a sound that I didn't have a word for. Not quite a sigh, not quite resignation, something in between. She said, "Run the projections again." I said, "I already know what they say, Commander." She said, "Run them again anyway." So I did, and they said what they'd been saying for the past 36 hours. With our current forces and operational defense capability, against an incoming fleet of that size and composition, our probability of successful defense of Kelvar Station was 2.1%. Not impossible. Not impossible in the way that 0 would be impossible, but close enough that the difference was mostly philosophical. Commander Tesh read the number. She nodded once, like it had confirmed something she'd already accepted. She said, "Then we do what we can." And she left to take her position. I want to tell you what it looked like through the external sensor feeds when the Dominion fleet arrived. It looked like a wall. I know that's not a precise description. I know that technically they were discrete ships at specific coordinates, that there was space between them, that a detailed tactical display would show you all of that with perfect clarity. But when I looked at those sensor feeds at 4:07 and watched the Dominion fleet complete its deceleration burn and settle into attack formation around Kelvar Station, What my brain showed me was a wall, something solid and total and absolutely certain of its own power. The Keth Magorath was in the center. Even on sensors, it had a presence that the other ships didn't. The Obliterator class was a design philosophy as much as a ship. The Varath Dominion had built it to be seen, to be feared. The hull was this dark material that absorbed sensor pings and gave back only a partial return, like the ship was partially not there. It had forward weapons arrays that could fire coordinated suppression patterns across a 100-kilometer sphere. It had been in 7 major engagements and had never been damaged. Not once, not a scratch. The Lesser Fleet arranged itself around it in the standard Dominion siege pattern, a formation that had been used to reduce stations and outposts across 20 years of expansion. It worked on the same principles as any siege. Overwhelming force, methodical pressure, systematic dismantlement. They didn't rush. They never rushed. That was the terrifying thing about the Dominion military. They were patient. They had time. At 4:12, the first communication came through. It was from the Dominion Fleet Commander, a Varath officer whose name translates roughly as dominance in victory, which should tell you something about Varath naming conventions. He had the kind of voice that sounded like it had never been surprised in its life. Flat, certain, like someone reading instructions. He said, "Kelvar Station, you will stand down. Your defensive systems will be powered off and your weapons deactivated within 30 minutes. After which, the Varath Dominion will take control of this installation in accordance with our campaign objectives. Any resistance will result in total destruction of the station and all personnel. This is not a negotiation. This is a statement of what will happen." Pause. "You have 30 minutes. Begin your countdown." Commander Tesh's voice came over the station-wide channel. She said, "All stations hold positions. Weapons remain hot. We have 29 minutes to figure out how to make the next 60 seconds of their day very uncomfortable." There was actually laughter in some sections. I heard it on the comm. Not much, but real. The kind of laughter that happens when people are scared and there's nothing left to do about it. I kept looking at the long-range sensors. I'm not sure why. Force of habit. The habit of a coordination officer who monitors all channels all the time. But I kept looking at the long-range band, the 40 light-minute radius that was well outside any useful combat range, just the edge of what our sensors could detect. And at 4:14, a contact appeared. A single contact, moving at a speed that made me look twice because it seemed wrong. I thought it was a sensor error. I ran a diagnostic check. The sensors were fine. That contact was moving at a speed I hadn't seen before. And it was moving toward us. Part 2, what came from the dark? I pulled up the contact data and stared at it for about 4 seconds trying to make it make sense. Single vessel, mass approximately equivalent to a coalition heavy assault transport. Drive signature, unusual. Not a warp signature exactly, more like a series of extremely rapid sequential microjumps, which was a propulsion technique that theoretically existed in the physics literature, but that no one had actually deployed because the navigational precision required was considered practically impossible. But here it was, a contact doing the thing that shouldn't be possible, moving at a sustained pace that put it at Kelvar in. I ran the calculation twice, approximately 48 minutes. I opened a channel to Commander Tesh. I said, "Commander, I have an inbound contact on long range, single vessel. It's the drive signature is unlike anything in my database." She said, "Dominion." I said, "No, too small, and the approach vector is wrong. Dominion reinforcements would be coming from the spinward quadrant. This is coming from exactly the opposite direction." Silence for 2 seconds. She said, "The humans." I said, "Their ETA was 4 hours ago at best speed. This contact would arrive in under an hour." Another pause. She said, "Keep watching it. Don't report it on general channels yet. I want to explain something about what the next 30 minutes felt like, because I think it's important." The Dominion fleet had not yet begun its attack. They were sitting in formation, waiting for their countdown to expire. 29 minutes, then 28, then 27. Our defense cannons were charged and ready. Commander Tesh had decided that when the deadline passed, we were going to fire everything we had at the Keth Magorath, not because we expected to damage it, but because making them pay attention to us, making them spend any additional time at Kelvar instead of moving immediately through to the supply lanes, was worth something even if we were gone. Every hour they spent at Kelvar dealing with us was an hour for the Coalition to redistribute supply routes, to warn the worlds in the lanes, to prepare. That was the plan, a sacrifice that was worth something, not much, but something. While the countdown ran, I kept my eyes on that long-range contact. It was doing something strange, not just the speed, the behavior. Normal ships in transit, even fast ones, follow predictable courses. They commit to a heading and hold it with minor adjustments for gravitational effects. This vessel was moving in a pattern that looked almost erratic if you watched it in real time, small course corrections happening every 40 seconds or so, tiny adjustments, like it was reacting to something I couldn't see. I've since learned what that was. I'll come back to it. At 4:29, 7 minutes before the Dominion deadline, a second contact appeared on long-range sensors, then a third, then 4 more coming in almost simultaneously, then 3 more. 17 minutes after the first contact appeared, I was looking at 14 contacts. All of them human vessels, all of them doing the same impossible micro-jump propulsion, all of them on slightly different approach vectors that would bring them to Kelvar from different angles. All of them arriving, if my calculation was right, within about 4 minutes of each other. I ran the calculation a third time, still the same answer. I opened a channel to Commander Tesh again. I said, "Commander, 14 contacts, all from the same source. Estimated arrival, all 14 within a 4-minute window, approximately 32 minutes from now." Her silence was longer this time. Then she said, "Send me the data." I sent her the data. 30 seconds passed. She said, "That's 14 human vessels arriving just as the Dominion deadline expires." I said, "Yes." She said, "Can they fight 47 Dominion ships?" I looked at my screens. I thought about it with everything I knew about Coalition records, about human military data, about the scale of what was on those sensors. I said, "I don't know." She said, "Neither do I." At 4:37, with 1 minute left on the Dominion countdown, something happened that still makes the hair on my arms stand up when I think about it. A comm signal came in, not from the Dominion. From the lead human vessel. I knew it was the lead because it had slightly separated from the others, moved 3 degrees ahead of the formation. The signal was addressed to the Keth Magorath. Not to Kelvar Station. Not to Commander Tesh, to the Dominion flagship. Direct. A human voice came through the channel. I want to be careful about how I describe this voice because I've tried many times and never quite gotten it right. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the movie poster version of a warrior issuing a challenge. It was calm, the particular kind of calm that isn't the absence of emotion but is the control of it. Like someone who has done something many times and has all the feelings about it but keeps them in a drawer because right now there's work to do. The voice said, "Dominion flagship, this is Commander Yara Solen, 14th Human Rapid Assault Division, Galactic Coalition. We are arriving at Kelvar Station in approximately 29 minutes. At that time, your fleet's tactical situation will change significantly. I'm giving you this notification in advance so you can begin making decisions before we arrive rather than during. Your countdown to Kelvar Station stands down. Effective now. You're no longer negotiating with the station. You're negotiating with us." Pause. "I'll be in touch." Signal ended. In the coordination room, nobody said anything for a moment. Then Sergeant Pell, a Seculan who ran communications and had 4 arms and had been feeding me coffee equivalent for the past 6 hours, said quietly, "She just told the Keth Magorath to stand down." I said, "Yes." He said, "There are 47 of them." I said, "Yes." He said, "Does she know that?" I said, "She definitely knows that." The Dominion Fleet Commander's response came 7 seconds after Commander Solen's transmission ended. 7 seconds is a very short response time when you're talking about fleet-level military communication. It suggests a level of surprise. He said, "Human vessel, your approach is noted. Your assistance to Kelvar Station is insufficient. Our countdown will proceed." Solen responded immediately. She'd been waiting for it. She said, "That's your choice. I want to make sure you understand the consequences of it before you commit. Fleet-wide transmission in 4 minutes. You'll want to see it." Another silence from the Keth Magorath. It was the first time in 7 major engagements that the Keth Magorath's commander had not immediately replied to a communication. People who have done the post-battle analysis have mentioned that detail. I noticed it in real time. Even at the time, even not knowing what the humans were about to do, the silence felt significant. Part 3, the arrival. I want to describe what it looked like when the human fleet dropped out of micro-jump propulsion at Kelvar Station. I was watching the sensor feeds at 4:49 station time when it happened. The 14 contacts had been closing steadily, and I'd tracked them long enough that I'd gotten a feel for the rhythm of their course corrections, the pattern of their movement. They were coming in formation, but not the standard coalition formation we used. It was something different, something I couldn't immediately name. I later learned it was called a Wolfpack diverge pattern. Humans had used it in their own ancient naval history. Ocean-going submarines, I was told, which seems almost impossibly primitive compared to what I watched happen at Kelvar. The idea is that the formation looks unified until the last moment, and then it separates into individual attack vectors simultaneously, each one a different angle, each one requiring independent response from the target. It was designed to overwhelm a defender's ability to prioritize threats. But the humans were using it the other way. They were using it on an attacker. They were 47. The humans were 14. The humans were using a formation designed to overwhelm a defender's priorities, and they were using it on a force 3 times their size. At 4:49, the first human vessel dropped from microjump. It appeared on sensors at a distance of 300 kilometers from the Dominion fleet's flank. 2 seconds later, a second vessel dropped in at a completely different angle, 600 kilometers from the fleet's opposite side. Then 3 more nearly simultaneously, all different positions. Within 90 seconds, all 14 human ships had dropped from propulsion. They were not grouped together. They were spread across roughly a 2,000-kilometer sphere around the Dominion fleet, not surrounding it exactly, but positioned such that the Dominion fleet's optimal response to any one human vessel put them at a disadvantage relative to 2 others. It was the most elegant piece of tactical spatial geometry I had seen in 32 years. In the coordination room, the Meridian tech officer who was monitoring sensors, his name was Adris, and he had 8 eyes and used all of them simultaneously, which I'd always found slightly unnerving, said, "They're inside the fleet's reaction distance." He sounded bewildered. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The Dominion formation assumes a minimum safe engagement distance, standard siege doctrine. These humans have placed themselves inside that minimum. The Dominion guns can't sweep in that configuration without risking friendly fire." I looked at the display. He was right. The humans had positioned themselves not around the Dominion fleet, but between the Dominion ships, inside the formation, so close that the Dominion flagship, if it fired its main weapons array in most directions, would be hitting its own fleet. How did they know the exact geometry of the Dominion formation before they arrived? How did they calculate approach vectors from 40 light-minutes away with precision sufficient to place 14 ships exactly where they needed to be inside an enemy formation they hadn't been able to see directly? I found out later, but at that moment, watching it happen in real time, I just stared. The fleet-wide transmission that Commander Solen had promised came through at 4:51 station time, right on her 4-minute mark. It was not what I expected. I'd been imagining some kind of communication about terms or possibly a demand or a tactical notice. What came through was a data packet. A large data packet. It took about 12 seconds to fully transmit, and when the Meridian text decoded it, what it contained was a complete technical analysis of the Keth Magorath's structural vulnerabilities. Not general vulnerabilities, not theoretical ones. Specific locations, specific component failures, specific stress points in the hull where previous engagements had left microfractures that had been patched with repair polymer, but remained structural weak points. Coolant distribution nodes that, under sustained heat buildup, would fail in a predictable sequence. Power conduits that had been rerouted after battle damage and now ran through hull sections that were less well-armored than the original design. The data packet showed the Dominion fleet commander that the humans knew everything about his ship that he knew about his ship. Maybe more. It wasn't a threat, it was information. Commander Solen was telling the Dominion fleet, We know your ship better than you think we do. Act accordingly. In the coordination room, Adris decoded the packet in about 30 seconds and turned to look at me with all 8 eyes. He said, "How do they have this?" I said, "I genuinely don't know." He said, "This is classified Dominion technical data. Where did they get it?" I said, "Adris, I genuinely don't know." He said, "The microfracture data alone, Commander, the depth of analysis here. They've been planning for the Keth Magorath specifically. This isn't general intelligence. This is targeted study of one specific vessel." I was still looking at the display, watching 14 human ships holding position inside a 47-ship Dominion formation that couldn't fire without hitting itself. I said, "How long have they been planning this?" Adris said, "Based on the depth of the data. A long time." What happened in the next 20 minutes was unlike any space combat I had ever observed or studied. The Dominion fleet tried 3 times to reorganize into a formation from which it could engage the human vessels without risking fratricidal fire. Each time the human ships moved, adjusted, not reactively, preemptively, as if they knew the reorganization was coming before it started. Actually, they did. I found this out afterward, too. Human computational systems. In 2026, their home planet had developed AI systems, and in the 30 years since they'd joined the coalition, they'd integrated and advanced those systems enormously, in ways that the rest of the galaxy had found somewhat alarming if they were being honest about it. The 14th Rapid Assault Division's command systems were running predictive fleet behavior modeling that was so accurate it bordered on prophecy. They could look at a Dominion fleet formation, analyze the tactical logic underlying it, predict the most probable reorganization sequence, and position 14 ships ahead of where the Dominion fleet was going rather than where it was. The Dominion fleet kept reorganizing to attack a position that was already empty by the time the reorganization completed. The human ships never fired. They didn't need to, not yet. What they were doing was more elegant. They were using the Dominion fleet's own mass as a weapon against it, forcing it to either remain in a formation it couldn't fight from or fragment, and fragmented individual Dominion ships were much more manageable targets. From the station, I watched the Dominion fleet make the same mistake in 3 different versions. Each time they tried to move, they ended up in a worse position than before. At 5:09, Commander Solen opened a channel to the Keth Magorath again. She said, "Fleet Commander, you've had 20 minutes to assess what you're looking at. I think you know what you're looking at by now. I'd like to have a conversation before anyone fires a shot." This time, the Dominion Fleet Commander's response took 43 seconds. He said, "Human Commander, you are 14 vessels against 47. Your tactical advantage in this moment is real, but it is temporary." She said, "Is it? We've been inside your formation for 20 minutes and you haven't been able to change that. What does your modeling say happens in the next 20 minutes? Silence. She said, "I'm going to tell you what our modeling says. You have 4 viable reorganization paths from your current formation. We've prepositioned for 3 of them. The 4th one you can probably execute, but it takes approximately 11 minutes to complete, during which time you will have 7 ships that are completely isolated and exposed. 7 ships that we can engage without geometry constraints. We'll lose some of ours. You'll lose more of yours. And you still won't have a firing solution on the station." Pause. "Or you can talk to me." Part 4, the 5 hours. I should clarify something about the title of this account, the 5 hours. The battle itself, the portion involving weapons fire, lasted 47 minutes. What lasted 5 hours was everything else. What the humans called in their communication logs the engagement, which was a word they used to describe the entire arc of a confrontation, not just the fighting part. The fighting part was 47 minutes. The other 4 hours and 13 minutes was something that I don't have a good word for in any language I speak fluently. It was not negotiation exactly. It was not combat. It was something that the 14th Rapid Assault Division apparently did as a matter of deliberate doctrine, something their training programs had developed over the 30 years since humanity joined the coalition, something based on principles that had roots in their own history of warfare on a single planet where they had fought each other for thousands of years and learned, sometimes slowly and painfully, how wars actually ended. Wars didn't end because one side destroyed the other. That was the surface story. The real ending came when one side became convinced that continuing was worse than stopping. Commander Solen had built a plan around that. At 5:17, the Keth Magorath's fleet commander accepted the conversation. His name, as I mentioned, translates roughly as dominance in victory. I'll call him Dav for simplicity's sake, and also because he later told me, in a very long debrief conducted by Coalition Command, that he found the conversation with Commander Solen to be the most unusual experience of his military career. He told it with something that in a Varath might have been a kind of reluctant respect. What Solen told him, over the course of the next 40 minutes, was a story. Not a threat, not a tactical briefing, a story. She told him the story of 7 previous engagements, where the Varath Dominion had committed to a battle it could have chosen to resolve differently, and had paid a price that still hadn't been fully accounted for in its strategic planning. She had data. Casualty figures, material losses, political fallout. She presented it clearly without drama, like someone reading a medical chart to a patient and explaining what the numbers meant. Then she told him the story of what would happen here. Not what the humans would do to the Dominion, what the Dominion would do to itself by choosing to continue. She said, "You can break out of the current formation, I told you how. You lose 7 ships doing it, maybe we lose 3 or 4 of ours in that sequence. You get a firing solution on the station and you take Kelvar, probably, at cost. You control the supply lanes. For how long? Coalition rerouting protocols are activated the moment Kelvar falls. By the time your fleet is resupplied and repositioned, you're looking at a different strategic picture than the one you came here to take advantage of. The window you were trying to hit closes while you're still here, and you've spent, at minimum, 7 ships and several months campaign time. And the Coalition will know from Kelvar exactly how you fight, exactly what your fleet does when it's in a constrained geometry, because we'll have records of this entire engagement." She let that sit for a moment. She said, or fleet commander, you do something that no Dominion fleet commander has done in this war, and you take something home that matters more than Kelvar Station. He said, "What would that be?" She said, "Information. We know things about your strategic objectives that you don't know we know. Some of what we know we got from the same sources that gave us the Keth Magorath technical data. Some of what we know we worked out. We've been working it out for months. The picture we have of where this war is going, what the Dominion is actually trying to accomplish over the next 3 years. If that picture is accurate, and we believe it is, then taking Kelvar Station right now is tactically smart and strategically wrong. We can show you why." Another silence from the Dominion commander. He said, "You are claiming to know our strategic planning better than we do." She said, "I'm claiming our analysis of your strategic planning leads to a different conclusion about what you should want. I think if you look at the analysis, you'll see what I mean." He said, "And in exchange for this information." She said, "Kelvar Station. You leave. You come back in 3 months for a full diplomatic conversation because what we've found suggests there are aspects of what both sides want that don't actually require a war to resolve. But that's the 3-month conversation. Right now, today, all I'm asking is that you leave." Dav was quiet for a very long time. While this conversation was happening, I was tracking something that I need to mention because it shaped everything else. The human ships had not fired a single weapon. They had been at Kelvar for 38 minutes. They were holding position inside the Dominion formation, making micro-adjustments, doing this continuous motion that looked almost like a dance from the sensor display, keeping themselves exactly where the Dominion guns couldn't touch them. But that couldn't last forever. Fuel, thermal management. The micro-adjustments had a cost, and I was watching the human vessel's heat signatures slowly rising, which meant their drives were working hard to maintain position. I ran a rough calculation. They could probably maintain this for another 2 hours before they had to either disengage or fight. Commander Solen knew this better than I did. She was working with 2 hours. She was having a strategic diplomatic conversation with a Dominion fleet commander in a context where she had maybe 2 hours before her tactical advantage degraded, and she was spending that time not firing but talking. In 32 years, I had never seen anyone do that. The conversation between Solen and Dav lasted 40 minutes. Then there was a pause. Dav said he needed to transmit a query to Dominion High Command. Solen said she'd give him 30 minutes. He came back in 26. He said, "Human Commander, the information you offered regarding our strategic objectives, how detailed is it?" She said, "Detailed enough to be useful. I'll send you the summary package now. You'll be able to verify independently that we didn't construct it. It's based on data we received from a source, which is separate from the Kelvar question." She sent the package. What was in the package, I didn't know at the time. I've learned some of it since from people who were at the debriefs. Apparently, it was an analysis of long-term Dominion resource constraints that showed a fundamental strategic flaw in their 3-year expansion plan. They were planning to control a supply network that was actually going to be more expensive to maintain than it was worth to them, based on trends in the sectors they were targeting. The Coalition had done the economics better than the Dominion had. The humans had done it better than the Coalition. It said, essentially, "You are fighting for something that will cost you more than it gives you." Dov's response came 20 minutes after he received the package. He said, "We require 2 hours to consider." Solen said, "You have 2 hours." Part 5, the 47 minutes. At 6:57 station time, the Dominion Fleet Commander came back on the channel. He said, "Human Commander, our analysis of your strategic data is complicated. There are elements we dispute and elements we find credible. We are not in a position to make a commitment on diplomatic engagement from a field commander's authority. That requires a higher channel." Solen said, "Understood." He said, however, pause. He said, "The mathematical reality of our current formation and your positioning is not improving for us. We have been here for over 2 hours. Our fleet has consumed fuel it did not plan to consume, and the tactical picture does not favor a sustained engagement at this juncture." She said, "I know." He said, "You knew before you arrived what our fuel state would be at this point." She said, "We made a calculation." He said, "How?" She said, "Your fleet moved at standard transit speed from your last known position. We knew approximately how long you'd been in formation before we arrived. Standard Dominion fleet fuel consumption rates are in the public record from previous engagements. It wasn't difficult." He said, "You calculated our fuel state from public data and the timing of our approach." She said, "Yes." A very long pause. He said, "I find that frustrating." She said, "I'd expect so." He said, "We are withdrawing from Kelvar Station. This does not constitute a formal acknowledgement of any of the propositions in your strategic package. It constitutes a military decision based on current tactical circumstances." She said, "I accept that completely." He said, "We will initiate a withdrawal sequence at 7:10 station time. We expect your vessels to maintain current positions and not initiate pursuit." She said, "You have my word." At 7:10, the Dominion fleet began its withdrawal. They didn't rush. The Keth Magorath moved in a slow arc that took it to the clear space at the edge of the sensor field, and the fleet reorganized around it in the departure formation. A different shape than the attack formation, broader, the ships spreading out for warp initiation. They were methodical and professional, even in retreat, which told you something about the Dominion military. The human ships moved too, letting them go, opening lanes in the formation geometry that let the Dominion vessels clear without feeling boxed in. Deliberate. Considered. Solen was making sure nobody did something stupid in the last minutes because somebody felt crowded. At 7:44 station time, the Keth Magorath and the 36 Dominion ships still in range initiated warp. 10 of the smaller Dominion vessels had already preemptively broken position and left during the negotiation period, apparently without orders. That happens in fleets. Individuals make decisions when they don't like what the math looks like. Dov had enough on his plate without worrying about it. And then there was nothing on the long-range sensors except empty space and 14 human ship signatures, slow and steady, beginning to reduce their continuous micro-adjustments as the tactical necessity dissolved. I sat in the coordination room and looked at the screens. Adris, next to me, said something in Meridian that his translator rendered as, "It's over." Sergeant Pell made a sound. It wasn't a word, just a sound. I think it was relief. I didn't make any sound at all. I just watched the sensors and tried to understand what I had just witnessed. And I don't mean tactically. I understood the tactical picture. I mean I tried to understand how. How a species that had been in the coalition for 30 years, a species that was by most galactic standards relatively small and relatively fragile, how they had walked into what everyone on this station had calculated as a 2.1% chance of survival and turned it into this. Whatever this was, Commander Solen's ship docked with Kelvar Station at 8:31 station time. I was at the docking bay. So was Commander Tesh, which surprised me because Tesh rarely left the operational floor during or after engagements. But there she was, standing 4 steps back from the docking collar, hands clasped behind her, scales dark and settled. The docking collar extended and latched. A hiss of pressure equalization. The door opened. Commander Yara Solen was not what I had built in my imagination during the hours of watching her work. This was silly of me. I should have known better. But I think I'd constructed something larger in my head, something that looked like what she'd done, something obviously formidable. She was about average human height. Dark-skinned, close-cropped hair, wearing a coalition uniform that had been modified in small ways I later learned were standard for rapid assault units. Lighter materials, slightly different collar configuration, sleeve insignia that showed the 14th's designation along with something in a human script. She had the look of someone who'd been awake for about 22 hours and was fine with it. Dark eyes that moved quickly and settled completely when they focused on something. She walked through the docking collar and stopped in front of Commander Tesh. For a moment they just looked at each other. Tharan officer, human officer, 50 years of service against what must have been, I learned later, 19 years. A woman who had survived 7 engagements against the Dominion, twice with these kinds of numbers, against a woman who I had just watched do something that I didn't have words for yet. Commander Tesh said, "My station is still standing." Solen said, "That was the plan." Tesh said, "The plan involved arriving after we were dead." Solen said, "The plan involved not letting that happen. The ETA in the message was conservative. We'd already been moving before the message went out." Tesh said, "You started moving before we asked for help." Solen said, "We monitor coalition distress patterns. When Kelvar's defensive reports stopped transmitting improvement, we started moving. The first distress signal was confirmation, not initiation." Tesh absorbed this. She said, "You study us." Solen said, "We study everyone. It's how we do things." A pause. Tesh made the sound I didn't have a word for. The one that wasn't quite a sigh. She made it differently this time. It didn't sound like resignation. It sounded like something releasing. She said, "Welcome to Kelvar Station, Commander Solen." Part 6, What the Humans Told US. The debrief lasted 3 days. Solen and 4 of her officers, a weapons specialist named Kovac, a systems analyst named Dr. Farron, a tactical navigator named Osai, and a young officer whose name I never quite caught correctly and who spent most of the 3 days taking notes with the particular intensity of someone who is going to use all of it later, sat with Tesh's senior staff and went through the engagement piece by piece. I sat in on all of it. I wasn't supposed to. Technically, the debrief was above my operational clearance, but Commander Tesh on the first morning glanced across the room at me and said, "Vaz stays." Nobody argued with Commander Tesh. I want to share what I learned in those 3 days, because I think it's the most important part of the story. Not the battle, the thinking behind it. The micro-jump propulsion was the first question everyone had. How were they doing it? The theoretical physics existed. Coalition scientists had known for years that sequential micro-jumps could theoretically allow faster-than-standard transit while avoiding the long charge-up periods of standard warp drives. But the navigational precision required was considered impossible. A micro-jump executed with even fractionally imprecise calculations would put a ship inside a rock, inside another ship, inside nothing useful. Dr. Farron answered this one. She was a small woman with very dark hair and the particular kind of focused quiet that people who spend most of their time talking to computers sometimes have. She pulled up a display and showed us the calculation architecture. Humans, she explained, had developed AI systems on their home planet about 60 years before they joined the coalition. In the 30 years since joining, they had continued developing those systems, not the general-purpose systems the coalition used for various functions, but specialized systems for specific tactical applications. The navigation AI that handled micro-jump calculations was one of those. It was running on hardware that the Coalition didn't make, and that, as far as she knew, no other species had developed. She said, the calculation needs to happen faster than any biological brain can do it, and faster than the general-purpose systems the Coalition uses. We built something specific to the problem. It's been in development for 11 years. This was its first field deployment. Adris, who was also in the debrief, said, "You deployed experimental navigation technology at Kelvar." Farron said, "We deployed tested technology that hadn't been used in live combat conditions. There's a distinction." He said, "What would have happened if it had failed during approach?" She said, "We didn't put all our navigation eggs in one basket. Each ship had a backup conventional drive. We'd have dropped out of microjump and continued at standard warp. Arrived later." He said, "Late enough that we'd have been gone." She said, "That was the risk calculation we made before departure." Silence. He said, "And you decided to go anyway." She said, "We decided to go anyway." The tactical positioning, how they placed 14 ships inside a 47-ship formation with precision sufficient to exploit the formation's geometry, came from a different system. Osai explained this one. He was the tactical navigator, and he had the particular ease of someone explaining something they've thought about every day for years. The approach vectors were pre-calculated before the fleet departed, not from current sensor data but from modeling. They had built a complete model of the Dominion fleet's probable formation based on everything known about Dominion siege doctrine, the size of the fleet, the target, and the Dominion's standard spacing protocols. He said, "We calculated where they'd be and built our approach vectors around that calculation. We were solving for where they would be, not where they were." Tesh said, "What if they'd varied the formation?" Osai said, "We had 4 variant approaches built in. During the final approach, we were updating our model with real sensor data from long range. Our long-range capability is better than the Coalition's standard, and adjusting. We confirmed the standard siege formation at about 12 light minutes out, which gave us time to lock in the primary approach." Tesh said, "You had 4 backup plans." He said, "We had 4 variant primary approaches. The backup plan was fight differently. The strategic intelligence package, the material about Dominion's strategic planning that Solen had used to offer the fleet commander an alternative to fighting, was the thing nobody wanted to ask about because everyone wanted to know. Solen answered it herself without being directly asked. On the second day of the debrief, she said, "I know everyone is wondering about the intelligence package. What I can tell you is the source is protected, and I'm not going to discuss it. What I can tell you is that humanity has been systematically studying Verath Dominion strategy and resource economics since about 2 years after we joined the Coalition. Not because anyone asked us to. Because we thought it was important." Tesh said, "You've been studying them for 28 years. Solen said, "We've been studying them and everyone else for 28 years. We study the Coalition too. We study everyone we interact with." Silence. Tesh said, "That is a significant intelligence program." Solen said, "We have a word for what we did for most of our history. We called it war. We've been at it, species to species within our own planet for about 10,000 years. We got very good at understanding what other groups were thinking and planning. It was survival. We brought that skill set into the Coalition." A long pause in the room. She said, "We're not threatening anyone. We're just paying attention. We pay attention the way you pay attention to traffic before you cross a road." Someone, I think it was one of the Tharan officers, said, 47 ships was the traffic. She said, "Yes." He said, "And you crossed anyway." She said, "We calculated the trajectory." On the third day of the debrief, late in the session, I asked the question I'd been holding since the moment Solen's ship had appeared on long-range sensors. I said, "Commander Solen, you had models that told you the Dominion fleet would withdraw rather than fight. How confident were you in those models?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "What kind of answer do you want?" I said, "The honest one." She said, 63%. Nobody said anything for a second. She said, "We gave ourselves 63% on the full engagement plan. 37% of our modeling said the Dominion fleet commander would choose to fight, that he'd find a way out of the formation lock, and we'd end up in a combat exchange that was going to be ugly for everyone. I said, "You came to Kelvar with a 63% confidence model." She said, "We came to Kelvar with the best model we had." I said, "And if the model had been wrong?" She was quiet again. She said, "Then we'd have fought with what we had, as hard as we could for as long as we could." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you were here." I didn't know what to do with that answer. I'm still not sure I do. I retired from active coalition service 14 months after the battle at Kelvar Station. I was offered a promotion, Senior Strategic Coordinator, which was a significant step and would have taken me to high command. I turned it down. I wasn't broken. I want to be clear about that. I turned it down because I felt like I'd completed something. I'd spent 32 years trying to understand how wars worked, how you made decisions under pressure, how you calculated odds and made choices with incomplete information against adversaries who were trying to kill you. I thought I understood most of it. I thought I'd seen most of what there was to see. At Kelvar, I realized I'd been missing something. Something so fundamental that I'd been looking past it for 32 years without seeing it. The humans saw the situation differently than anyone else at Kelvar did. We, the coalition forces, looked at the incoming Dominion fleet and saw a threat to be resisted. Our planning was entirely about how to hold the station against the attack, how to make the attack cost something, how to delay the inevitable long enough that it mattered. The Dominion fleet looked at Kelvar and saw an objective. Straightforward military geometric thinking. Acquire the target, overcome the resistance, control the supply lanes. Clean problem, known solution. Commander Solen looked at Kelvar and saw something else. She saw a situation that hadn't been resolved yet. She saw the Dominion fleet commander as a decision-maker, not just an enemy. She saw the strategic information asymmetry, the fact that she knew things about Dominion long-term plans that the Dominion might not have fully internalized, as a tool, not a weapon, a tool. She saw the geometry of 47 versus 14 and didn't think, we can't fight that. She thought, what position do we need to be in for our other advantages to matter? And she solved for that position from 40 light minutes away. This is what humanity brought to the coalition. Not just technology, not just the AI navigation systems or the predictive tactical modeling or the intelligence programs. Those were real contributions. But the deepest thing, the thing I've been thinking about for 14 months since I left active service, is something harder to name. Humans see conflict differently. They've been doing it to each other for 10,000 years on a single planet. They never had anyone to run to. There was no coalition to call for help. When the math said you couldn't win, the math was a problem to be solved, not a conclusion to be accepted. Because the alternative, losing, wasn't acceptable. So you found the angle. You found the way the problem wasn't actually what it looked like. You studied your enemy until you knew them better than they knew themselves. You moved before anyone expected. You talked when everyone expected you to fight, and you fought when everyone expected you to collapse. They arrived late, and they still won in 5 hours. And the winning wasn't in the fighting. The fighting was 47 minutes. The winning was in the 28 years of paying attention. The winning was in the navigation system that took 11 years to develop and had never been tested in combat, and they brought it to Kelvar anyway. The winning was in the calculation that said 63%, and they went anyway. The winning was in a single human commander opening a channel to the Keth Magorath with 1 minute left on a deadline and saying, in absolute calm, "You're not negotiating with the station anymore. You're negotiating with us." I went back to Kelvar Station once, about 8 months after the battle. It was different. The coalition had sent proper reinforcements, proper equipment. The defense cannons were all running at full capacity, and there was actual military infrastructure instead of freight management consoles with comm arrays bolted to the walls. I stood on Platform 7, Section Bravo, where I'd stood when I first looked at those casualty projections. The haze was gone, the ventilation system had been repaired. The lights were a warmer color, the smell of coolant was fainter. I thought about those projections, 2.1%. I thought about Commander Tesh saying, "Then we do what we can." I thought about Commander Solen's ship appearing on the long-range sensors at 4:14 station time, moving at a speed that shouldn't have been possible, coming from the direction that nobody expected, arriving at the moment that nobody anticipated. I thought about 63%. And I thought about what it means to be human, not in the biological sense, in the older sense, The sense that means something about how you face the impossible. We in the Coalition like to think of ourselves as the civilized galaxy, ancient species, developed cultures, accumulated wisdom. We have species in the Coalition whose recorded histories go back 100,000 years. We have accumulated knowledge and mathematical models and probability systems that can calculate outcomes with extraordinary precision. The diplomatic contact that Commander Solen had mentioned as a possibility did happen. It happened not 3 months later, but 4, and it wasn't a full diplomatic conversation. It was a preliminary channel, what the Coalition terms a pre-contact exchange, conducted at a location I'm not going to specify because I wasn't there and I'm not going to speculate. What came out of it publicly was a partial ceasefire agreement in 3 of the contested sectors. Not a peace, not an end to the conflict, but something. The Verath Dominion didn't suddenly become something it wasn't. The war didn't end because of Kelvar. I want to be honest about that. This isn't the kind of story where one moment changes everything neatly. Real things don't work like that. But Kelvar changed something. The Coalition started talking about humanity differently after that. Not just in official channels. In the way that real things change. In the conversations that happen in mess halls and coordination rooms, and on long watches when people have time to think. In the way that the 14th Rapid Assault Division became something that people in the Coalition military talked about, the way certain units always get talked about after they do something that shouldn't have been possible. And humanity itself. I had a long conversation with Commander Solen near the end of the 3-day debrief, in a quieter moment, just the 2 of us in a side corridor while everyone else was eating. I asked her something personal. I said, "Did you believe it would work?" She said, "I believed the plan was good." I said, "That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment, leaning against the wall of the corridor, arms folded, looking at something I couldn't see. She said, "I believed we had to try. I believed that if I was wrong about 63%, if we ended up fighting 47 ships with 14, the people on this station still deserved someone trying. Even if the trying didn't work. Even if all it did was buy some time." She said, "That's what we do. We show up. And we try, even when the math says not to, maybe especially then." I thought about that. I said, "Do you know why that is?" She said, "We don't have a choice. We spent 10,000 years without anyone else to call. You develop certain habits." I think about that conversation when I think about what happened at Kelvar. When I try to explain it to people who ask, and people do ask, because it's the story that went around the entire Coalition in the weeks after the battle, the story that got passed from fleet to fleet and base to base. I usually say, a battle that couldn't be won was about to happen, and 14 human ships arrived and made the word couldn't complicated. People want me to say it was the technology, the navigation AI, the predictive modeling, the intelligence packages, and those things mattered, they mattered enormously. But what I keep coming back to, what I think about on quiet nights when I'm not sleeping well, and I get up and look at the stars through whatever window is nearest. The technology was built by people who believed it was worth building even though it hadn't been proven. The plan was made by someone who had a 63% model and went anyway. The channel was opened to the Keth Magorath with 1 minute on the clock by a commander who looked at 47 warships and said, "We're not done talking yet." That's not technology. That's something older. Something that comes from 10,000 years of not having anywhere else to run. Something that comes from being, of all the species in the galaxy, the ones who looked up at the stars for most of their history and didn't know if anyone else was there, but kept looking anyway. The battle was unwinnable. And then humanity arrived. And for 5 hours, they made the universe reconsider.